Hello and welcome to the sixth episode of the Poona Sci-Fi Book Club. Today we are discussing Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary, a spiritual successor to his first book, The Martian. We have Bharat and Vivek on the podcast as usual, so hello guys.
Hello.
Hi.
So as we always do, we'll spend a few minutes discussing the book without spoilers, and then in part two we'll dig into the details, and we will obviously have spoilers then. So Bharat, since you picked this book, do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Okay, so this book is basically about a space mission to save humanity. What's happened here is that humans, not too far in the future, have detected an alien microbe, which is slowly feeding off of the sun. They decide to call this microbe astrophage. What they found is that this astrophage has been breeding or accumulating near the sun and then moving to Venus for replication and then going back and forth, and therefore sort of replicating exponentially, which is called sun-solar output to dim in an exponential manner as well. So what this is going to inevitably result in is an ice age in the next couple of decades, and therefore humans have to somehow figure out a way to understand where this alien microbe came from and a way to stop it from eating away at the sun. The start of the book is quite interesting. It's from a point of view of a microbiologist / a high school teacher who was woken up in a single room with two other dead people around him, and apparently is also suffering from amnesia. And so the book starts off with his journey about how he starts figuring out what's happening around him and how he slowly starts recalling events from the past as he recovers from his amnesia. So that's basically the setup of the book. I'm happy to talk about my general impressions about it once Vivek and Mohit have had a go.
Yeah, Vivek, you want to go?
So yeah, that's pretty much the book. It's like The Martian taken to like the next level. I really enjoyed this book. It was very, very entertaining. There are some parts of it which of course you can nag about it, but I think it's the core of what the author likes to do, which is telling these kind of thriller-based stories with like really hard science fiction, like not hard science behind it. I think he did that really, really well. Whole tone. It's a fairly upbeat kind of book despite the kind of background of the entire premise. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's much better than The Martian, I think, in my opinion. Plus, like the central character has a good arc even within it. You know, they have a little story within the whole story, which I liked. That wasn't there really in The Martian, I felt. So yeah, it's a great book. I really enjoyed it, and there are good things about it, and then there are lots of like fun things to nitpick also about it. But overall, I thought it was very, very entertaining, which is I think what the book was aiming to do, and so it really hit that spot.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Vivek, and that's how I described it in the beginning, right? Like I think it's a spiritual sequel to The Martian. It's the same sort of setting. It's like one guy who is a scientist in this case is an engineer in The Martian, just trying to science his way out of trouble, and agree that it is a better book. Like you can tell that The Martian was like the first book that Andy Weir had written, or like the first published book at least, because I do feel like there's practically nothing in way of like character growth or anything of that sort. Like it's just problem, and him solving problems. And here you get to explore a little bit of the humanity of this Dr. Island Grace, who is the protagonist, right? So I definitely 100% enjoyed it. I had read this book about a year ago and did not reread it for the podcast. Instead, I spent like 3-4 hours before the podcast kind of just speed reading through the whole book. So I'm pretty fresh on everything.
People are going to lose faith in our podcast.
The one grumble or complaint
What
that
do you think I do every time?
Yeah,
My
but
gosh,
yeah,
am I
but
the only one who's like rigorously taking notes?
no,
like
no,
a stink trap.
I'm doing that. I'm taking notes and everything. It's just that I've read this book before, and that's what I'm coming to, right? Like I think that the main criticism I have of this book is that I don't think it's like a super enjoyable reread. And I think that's true of The Martian as well. Like I think they are like rollicking fun to read one time around, but I
Yeah.
don't know if there's much like rereading value. Once you've seen the spoilers that obviously we'll
Yeah.
get to in part two of the podcast. Like once you've seen the major plot elements, I feel like there isn't that much to bring me back to this book. Like definitely would read it once.
It's a pretty simple book, yeah.
Yeah.
The reason why I super enjoyed this book is just because of the way the protagonist uses just high school science to do a lot of things. And I was like
Yep.
transported back to days of IIT preparation. We were like trying to solve problems from physics, except in this case now he's applying the same high school science to like things more important than what is the speed of a block going down on a wedge, which is what we did. So I think it was really fantastic because of that. And again, it's like a personal nostalgia. Not everyone might enjoy it. But I felt in many cases, the author, when he does sort of go into like the science heavy topics, he does have like a simple analogous explanation each time, which summarizes like the deep technical explanation. So that was super nice as well.
So I found that and this is true of The Martian as well. Like the books are like fantastically well researched. Like I never felt that, oh, this seems like a leap. I mean, there's one that we'll talk about in the spoilers, but
Oh, there are some giant leaps, but they're not where you think.
right, and we'll get to that, right? Like I think we are in agreement of what those leaps are. We'll get to that when we get to it. But I'm just saying that from the pure science perspective, there aren't a lot of gaps. Like I think it's thoroughly well researched. The problems are like well done. The one thing that I still find, and I hope that Andy Weir has like a long career ahead of him, and it doesn't involve just writing one guy in a room trying to solve a problem. But I do find that this still feels a little bit like someone who is still finding his feet, because the flashback where you get to hear his
Yeah.
story and the backdrop and everything, I feel like in the flashbacks, the narrative element, like there's a lot of exposition to explain the science that's going on. But I feel like some of that is really on the nose, where it's either someone explaining to Ryland Grace something that should be obvious to Ryland Grace, or the other way
Yeah.
around. That's one aspect of it, and the other aspect of it is when he gets invited to random meetings to solve random problems that he is not qualified to solve. Like he's a microbiologist, and then someone wants him to explain how radiation in space affects things, and I'm just like, this, he's not the guy. Why is he in this meeting? Like this makes
So,
no
so no,
sense.
the one thing we should mention is that there is a underlying reason why he's gone, because he is not just the microbiologist, he's an exobiologist. So that's why they have him studying the astrophage in the first
Sure.
place,
Sure.
because
Yeah. Like,
he's had a lot of theories on
no,
alien biology,
him
and
being involved
hence,
in the biology part of it, I'm completely fine with. But it's like when they start asking him, it's like, oh, how do we do radiation shielding? And I'm like, he's not the radiation shielding guy. Like this is clearly a plot element so that I, the reader, understand how radiation shielding works. And I feel like you as a writer need to do a better job of like hitting me in the face with this information.
I'll let it pass, because if you see the solution to the radiation thing, it's like, okay, fine.
Yeah, and these are not like definitely not a reason not to read this book. Like I thoroughly enjoyed it, but
Yeah.
I'm just saying that it's one of those things where yes, the science is
They're like
well
funny. They're like funny.
right. I guess what I'm just trying to say is that I think the science is very well researched and well explained.
Yeah.
I would just like a little bit more subtlety when the reader is being hit in the face with the science. That's I guess all that I'm getting at. Like that's my only
Got it.
overarching nitpick of the book. But yeah, back to you guys.
Sort of like related, again, a nitpick that sort of relates to what you said. Not directly, but it's basically how humanity gets together to solve crisis. And I've seen this kind of a thing in the three-body problem as well, where, they'll always select certain individuals to like solve the problem for them. And I feel that is not how humanity should react when a crisis occurs.
That entire part of it in 2022 for a book
Seriously.
written in 2021 is just like no, that's like not gonna happen. It's science fiction in more than one way.
Yeah.
But I do want to point out that I think this is it sort of reflects on I think his view on life. Like I think he is this relentlessly optimistic kind of person who hopes for the best, because this is also true in The Martian, right? Like The Martian, I forget the dude's name, but like he finally gets back to Earth because you have multiple different space agencies doing all kinds of crazy things, coordinating to make sure that he gets supplies and stuff.
I can still buy that space agencies help each other out, right?
Yeah.
But this book, I was like,
Yeah.
but then you move past that, so it's
Yeah,
fine.
I mean, like it's just
Exactly.
that's I think like a necessary requirement. I don't think the book works at all without the amount of international cooperation required. So that's fine. Like
Yeah,
I'm willing to overlook
Maybe,
that.
but Does it though? Like, okay, maybe we should get into spoilers because all that part requires like
Yeah, I think
talking about the rest.
if there's any other stuff that you want to talk about, we can maybe spend another 5-ish minutes talking about any other like non-spoilery stuff.
Just to mention, like the alien life dealt in this book, the astrophage microbes. It was interesting. Like I have not seen like alien life. I think it sort of stretched alien life to like have very interesting biological / chemical properties.
Yes.
Which I mean, at least I haven't seen in sci-fi so far.
Yeah, like the central point of the book, like revolving around this astrophage and the properties of the astrophage, as we learn later, and we'll talk about a little bit more in the spoiler part as well. But like just the fundamental notion of this interstellar bacteria that somehow like lives on stars and their surrounding planets, like that was like a really fascinating thing, which I've never seen anything like that before. So that was
maybe the last thing to mention for like listeners would be that the central protagonist is part of everything that happens because he has a theory on non-carbon oxygen kind of based life, which is why when this life form is discovered, he's kind of brought on to be the first person to kind of study it. So that theme of like exobiology in general runs throughout like the book, and actually there's I thought a lot of the really original, I don't say original, but really interesting simple ideas from that which were kind of thought-provoking.
Yep. So, okay, do you all have any other observations before we get to the spoiler part? And I apologize to the listeners that we have a very short part 1 of the podcast, but I also feel like there's so much interesting stuff in the book that if we had to talk about, we'd have to talk about something that's going to spoil the book. So I think it's for the best that it's short, but yeah, I do apologize that we don't have much more to talk about other than saying it's a great book.
I don't have anything else to say except that it's a wonderful book. Say 4.9 stars out of 5. Thoroughly enjoyable. Super nice.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. 5 on 5 and pure entertainment.
Yep, I would say it's a 5 on 5. Yeah. I don't have much more to say. So beyond that, before we move on to part 2 of the podcast, the announcement for our next episode, Vivek has picked Permutation City by Greg Egan to be the next book that we discuss. So we'll all be reading that book and recording the next episode talking about that. Hopefully we'll get it to you a little bit sooner than this episode came out. We were in scheduling hell where just one of us couldn't make it, no matter what time we picked. So hopefully Permutation City, we talk about that a little bit sooner. But yeah, that's all that we have for part 1. So we'll see you on the other side of the break. Okay, so Bharat, you had wanted to get into some of the spoiler stuff even in part 1 of the podcast. You want to lead us into it?
Sure, yeah. So basically, like I mentioned, this book is on 2 phases. The first one is where like shows the story of Ryland Grace as he wakes up in a completely unknown room with 2 other dead people stuck to a catheter and is trying to figure out what's going on. The other phase is basically his flashbacks as he starts recovering from his amnesia. So I want to talk a bit about like the second part, which relates more to like how humanity figures out what astrophage is and where it's come from. As we discussed in the first part, this astrophage is dimming the sun at an exponential rate. And what astronomers find out is that it's happening to other stars in other nearby solar systems. And so they figure out or derive that this astrophage has somehow been like spreading like mold or like spores from one solar system to another. And an interesting thing is that they have infected many of the stars in the local star systems, except for one, which is the Tau Ceti solar system. That ends up being the aim of Project Hail Mary, which is to send a group of people from Earth or to the Tau Ceti solar system and figure out why astrophage is not affecting their star the same way it is doing to the sun. Alright, so that was, I guess, one major spoiler. By certain events, our hero Ryland Grace, who is an exobiologist who is expert in like alien microbes, I guess, or extraterrestrial microbes. Somehow he gets picked for the mission, and then we can get into those details if you like. But he reaches the Tau Ceti solar system using astrophage as a fuel. That also is something that keeps on happening on the side as this mission builds up, which is to use the properties of astrophage as like super efficient fuel that can like get you to like a very high speed and then allow you to reach the Tau Ceti system in a matter of few human years, like 3 to 4, which would be about 10 to 12 years, I think, in terms of like for the people living on Earth. So once he gets there, he wakes up, figures out that he is in a spaceship and he's in a completely different solar system. And then he realizes that there is another alien life form, which is also in a different spaceship, which is also present in this Tau Ceti solar system. Turns out to be a life form from this system called as Eridani, I think, 40 Eridani solar system, which are, I think, heptapods, like a spider-like species that have also come here because their solar system has also been infected by the same problem.
Pentapods, I think, but yeah.
5 legs? Yeah, you might be right. So basically, the story then is about how Ryland Grace and this alien, which he calls as Rocky, join forces together to figure out why the Tau Ceti sun is not being affected by the astrophytes so much.
Yep. So I think getting into this, the biggest thing that bothers me, of course, has to be communication. Like, and I'm sure that's the thing that you guys were also annoyed with, or at least stood out as a problem. It's like there is no way that
it was easy for them to communicate.
It is so easy for them to communicate, like too easy.
Too easy.
Like that.
How?
I like that they were like smart enough to be able to like talk to each other.
I don't think that
they were basically similar culturally, so it was.
I don't think that that's really possible, given that it's not even like they're making just Eridanians or Eridians, whatever they're called. They speak with just sound, just like whale-like sounds. So it's not.
So the fact that he's able to like pick up on like what he's saying.
Like I think that is like the most problematic part of the book to me, because there is no chance in hell that a scientist, and like these are not even linguists. Like if you told me,
he has a translator.
He doesn't have a translator. He manually translates.
He does. He has a computer which like translates the things. He creates a word bank with him.
Right, but he's building the word bank. Like he.
Yeah, so they show each other objects, and then he does the sound.
No,
then he records it on word bank.
I cannot believe that. Like I think that if you had told me that a human linguist and an Eridanian linguist got together and thrashed out a translation scheme over like months, I would say maybe. But like an engineer and a scientist getting together and thrashing out translation in 3 days or whatever it takes is like, that's nonsense.
But I thought they were there for like months, right? I thought they were there for like months doing this stuff.
No.
Like many weeks.
No, he explicitly says that they basically figure out a broad vocabulary over a matter of a few hours.
Not a few hours.
No, it literally says few hours. Like I read the book like 2 hours ago.
Okay.
So
the speed reading helps.
He gets a bit of like science lingo, but then there's this extended scene where he like goes back and keeps talking about other things, and like, then it kind of like and that period is not clear how long that is.
And my issue with that is that you could have just kind of explained that away, because he explains away a lot of other stuff, right? Like he explains away why Rocky is talking in units that human beings understand. It's like, oh, because Rocky's brain does maths very quickly, and so rather than him having to say something and the protagonist having to explain it, having to translate it, which obviously is clunky from a literary perspective, is just explained away saying this guy's a maths genius, so he just speaks in human units. I'm like, I don't see any.
He doesn't speak in human units. He speaks in his unit, but his translator converts it into the human equivalent.
He speaks in human units. His translator is not doing that, because he.
I understood that as that like they've established a relative like whatever conversion ratios, and then the system just like automatically converts whatever he's saying into that.
It doesn't. It's this guy does the math. Like Rocky does the maths in his head and says it out. Like their brains just process maths very well,
easily,
and so he's able to.
That's fine, right? He does maths,
exactly.
And they're very dumb in other ways, right?
Exactly. That's my point. That you've just explained it away, and that's elegant. Like I can believe that there's an alien that's like way better at maths than I am. Like sure, but I didn't get. I don't think there was any point to the Eridanians not having computers. Okay, and.
There's a whole issue with Eridians which I want to talk about.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Anyway.
But there are some. I have a sneaking suspicion there's some inconsistency in their level of scientific knowledge relative to what they're shown to already possess. But I can't put my finger on it because I don't know if it's right or not.
Okay, so let me just finish what I'm saying now. So they clearly they do not have sophisticated computers. There is no reason. The plot would not change.
They have no computers. The guy has no clue.
The guy has no computers, and they have no plot. There is no plot reason that requires them to not have computers. Okay. Having said this, why not just have a computer that does translation? Like I would totally buy that this civilization.
He's Chacha Chaudhary, computer like brain.
His brain works faster than a computer. Yeah.
His brain is computer.
So
Oh man.
no, it's just that's kind of what bothers me. That there's like dumb things like, oh, here's an engineer and a scientist, and they figured out a whole language together in a matter of days.
I was okay with that. It's like an optimistic book.
No,
and
and
it was like,
and again, that's fine. Like, I don't think it takes away from what the book is. I 100% enjoyed reading it. I'm just like, it's dumb, and you could have done something relatively easily that doesn't change the book significantly, and it's easier for me to swallow.
Just to follow up on like the whole communication aspect, I was reading an article on Ars Technica. I don't know if you guys have. It's about this aspect about Project Hail Mary from like a linguist's perspective on this. And what she says is that the biggest problem wasn't figuring out the words and like the syntax, but the problem more is that communication is sort of like dependent on like mutually shared experiences and feelings. And so because these two species have like been brought up in like different chemical biological systems, and because their bodies are like very inherently different, their motivations, their personal motivations are also going to be very, very different. And so one example she gives is like explaining the meaning of the word grace to Rocky, because again, like grace is like it's a mixture of it's not just like a word, like it's not just like a simple set of actions. It like involves emotions, it involves facial expressions, which the alien might not be even able to comprehend. And so this could still be possible. This could still happen only if like both of them like have a shared sense of motivations, their definitions of friendships, love, what cooperation means to each species individually. It's a long article, and
yeah, I mean,
I
think that's definitely something where you have to. I agree, and like I said, right, like that's been my major nitpick. But I'm willing to just say that, okay, that's like suspension of disbelief.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I disagree with the. I don't know the article, whatever, not to disagree with the linguist, but they do establish that. I mean, they do establish emotional parallels between.
I think you need to start the sentence with, I'm not a linguist, but.
Yeah, I'm not like by the way, like I don't even know if they would, like any of us would know, right? But they do establish that there is like a scientist, and the whole point of that interrelationship, I thought, was like they have commonality through science and their motive. And actually, these Eridanians are very social in terms of certain like aspects. So and there was a lot of shared empathy in at least how they approach the world. So thought like empathically, and given what they do as professions in the situation they were in, they actually had a lot of shared kind of experience to that extent. So I didn't think that was the major thing. The major difference was just the physicality of that interaction, right?
What her claim is that these should not be, given that you are like growing up in very different atmospheres, your social structures are very different. It's possible that, or it seems pretty incredible that they do end up sharing like having those shared feelings and like a common interest and like common agreement to like emotions. So that was like her approach to this. But anyway, it's again. I felt it was
so I guess we've talked about the language thing, and Vivek was nodding vigorously when I said there are things that are problematic that I want to talk about, and it's not the language thing for Vivek. So like, what was your thing?
Oh yeah, so I had only a couple of three things, right? I have one okay, so the first part of it, obviously, international cooperation, how the world responds to this, right? That was just completely wrong. That would never happen. Okay, they would never tell us the sun is dimming. Okay, number one, no one would tell us. That would just set off mass panic, and it is just bad. Nobody's going to do it. Okay, they are not going to cooperate. And this astrophage that is found is like the biggest discovery in terms of energy, in terms of like space travel, everything, right? Like, so nobody is like the person who could grab that first would have kept it for sure, right? And they would have first like conquered the world with it and then done whatever else they wanted. There is no way that the scenario that they show in the book, where like the UN gets its act together and there's one person calling the shots, and China, and also I don't understand certain basic things. I was like, okay, you want to do all your tests on an aircraft carrier because you think it might be very explosive, and you do it in the South China Sea, like the most populated, like, sea going straight with like hundreds of ships and like bunch of countries around it. Why not do it like in the Pacific, man, with like, US aircraft carrier, in the middle of like actually nowhere. So they were like, that part of it was just hilarious to me. I was like, this book was written in 2021, right?
released in 2021, so
It
like
was released in 2021, right? So it was released in 2021, and we are in 2022. And I was like, there's no way any of this ever happens, right? I was like, and it didn't seem as if like there was any need for all the international cooperation. Their science was pretty basic. At least all the discoveries on the astrophage they made, and once they at least discovered how to harness it as a, and some very random person sitting in a prison cell managed to figure out how to use grow it, and then figured out how to use it as fuel. So I don't think they really needed, if you remember Contact, right? The movie Contact, right? And in Contact, like, you get an alien message, everybody bands together and builds this really complex device that requires like trillions of dollars of investment. So it's almost like ITER. So we all have to band together, and it's like not an emergency, but we do it as a kind of international project to like, meet our neighbors. And I was like, okay, that was kind of believable. And that had all the issues with that also, right? All the problems around that also. So that was the biggest gripe I had with the book. So it's like, I know that the book is not meant to touch on those aspects and it was like a yay go book. But yeah, it's more likely that he would have ended up there and there would have been a Chinese person with him and a Russian person, and they all start fighting and killing each other around Tau City rather than anything actually happening. So that was the biggest gripe I had with the book. But it kind of goes away in the first half, and then the second half is just like fun. So it's like, it's fine.
yeah.
Yeah, I was, again, like, for me, I feel like they would have been able to, like, I think it would have leaked anyway that the sun is dimming, because this observation is made by, I think, citizen scientists who just sent out an email.
Yeah, the Petrova person who discovers it.
You know what would have happened to them? They would have been called climate science deniers, and they would have been erased from Facebook by saying fake news, and disinfo. And there's a part in the book where they nuke Antarctica to cause climate change. I was like, Jesus. Yeah. I was like, really? You think anyone would agree to that on an international level? And plus, why would you even do that preemptively when you don't know exactly what's going to happen?
No, I think they explain that well. I don't think that there's a problem with that.
They explain why they're doing it, but to do it right now and like nuke the entire continent, that just seemed excessive. It's like, maybe do it slowly. Like, why?
No,
like, you could have. My problem was the way they were approaching. They would have killed the planet themselves before, like, the astrophage did anything, right? Like, all those violent changes which you were introducing, you farmed half the Sahara and created climate change right there. You nuked Antarctica and created climate change. We were dead. We would be dead long before they found the solution to the astrophage, right?
I think their point was just that if we don't do this, we are dead anyway. We might as well roll the dice. Like, even if it's like a 20% chance of success, it's a 20% chance of success versus a 100% chance of failure.
But why not just build giant heating bunkers or insulated farming? We're going for an ice age, right? We know exactly what we're in for if the sun dims, right? So, and you have 30 years for that.
No, but that it's going to affect our agricultural system as well, na?
And Francois does explain that since it took us decades of pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to even realize that, we happen to have an effect on climate change. Like, it's very difficult to do it on that scale. And the point is just that you can release vast amounts of methane and get that effect quickly, which would take you decades.
They said, and they would flood coastlines across the world, right? And all these countries are like, yeah, please do it. There was no chance any of that happens, right? And you think the climate change lobby is just going to roll over and be like, okay, 30 years from now, we're going to die. That's anyway what they're saying, right? So why should they give up, right? This, like, all that part of it was just like, I was like, you're just going to kill the planet before the astrophage does. And like, none of this is going to matter. Yeah. But once you pass that point, I was like, okay, fine, international. I don't think they need an international cooperation. I think the science on that seems simple enough that he was able to do it, most of it sitting in there. There was nothing they didn't build anything combined which was very complicated. Like, I mean, the astrophage is super easy to grow, and then they had this very simple system by which its propulsion works. So, like, why do you really need 3 of them? They could have made like.
Did you all understand how that spin drive works?
Sort of.
I couldn't figure out what was going on there. Like, I reread that part. I remember when I read it a year ago, I had to like reread it multiple times and I gave up. And then again this morning as I was reading it, I was like, I cannot make sense of this. I just gave up.
I felt it was similar to the Wenkel engine where have that triangle instead of square and they just propel and then that's how it keeps moving, but just with astrophage. Okay. Again, I had a good I think I spent like an hour just trying to like focus on that, but now I've forgotten because this was a month back.
Yeah. Sorry, Vivek, we interrupted you.
I didn't understand, but sorry, I was wrong on that. There is one thing they need global cooperation for, which is to cultivate the astrophage. Because that is a monumental issue and they need like everybody's help on that. But yeah, other than that, they didn't need anybody's help. So I'm not certain that, Maybe like the US would have invaded Mexico and just done it there, or like like Europe would have just done it anyway in Sahara. Like I'm not certain, or like China would have just done it in Mongolia. So I'm not entirely certain about that part, but yeah, that was still like funny. I think I just don't know about their and why did they send only 3 people? Was that like because they couldn't build enough? No, it was a fuel mask thing, right? So they couldn't.
Yeah.
because
There was a fuel mask.
every person needs like food and space and all that stuff, right? So they settled on 3 that way.
No, I think it was just more about just the
Certain
astrophage.
but I'm not certain that was the only way that they could have, like, wasn't there anything else that they could have done to cultivate more astrophages? I'm not sure. Maybe not. I don't know.
I mean, in that period of time, probably not, because the time window is very short, right? Like I actually thought that was interesting in this book, that you tend to think of like it's the exploding bomb situation, right? And except that it's set over such a long period of time. And I think that the author does do a good job of kind of impressing upon you how urgent things are, even though we are talking on the scale of years, which I thought was well done, because it's very hard to do that sort of countdown timer thing on a big scale.
Yeah.
Oh.
There was also a need, right? Because they had time dilation and all of that.
No,
So
but time dilation
had
works
to
for
act now.
him.
No, for him, not for them.
Yeah.
For Earth, it's fine. It's like time going by. Like it will take
Because
12
you
years
take
for
12 years and 12 years back, right?
Right.
So,
correct, but for him it's just like 3 or 4 years of time experienced. But then it's interesting that they stopped with this mission, and like they sent out this mission and then they stopped. Like again, but it's
You
not
don't
shown
know that.
maybe because
You don't know.
yeah,
anything.
exactly. You don't know
I don't know that.
But I mean, given that, like, I don't know, he gets there in 12 years and then maybe, I don't know, how long does he stay in?
I see, like, if you think of the method the Eridanians used, right, which is they had a sea, which was under high pressure and high temperature, and they just like buried this thing there in xenonite boxes and it grew, right? That's what they did. Now, once you had a little bit of astrophage, we could have gone to like Venus ourselves, right? And we could have just like immersed, like, maybe we didn't have xenonite, maybe that was the issue.
Yeah.
But we could have found a hot, big place where we could have just buried a ton of this thing. I think that they just went to the step of let's just have enough astrophage to go to Tau City, and didn't think of what you could do once you had a little bit of astrophage. We'll let you go around your own solar system super fast.
Yeah, but I imagine that they must be doing stuff like that in the background, right? Like while he's flying, it's not like they've done the thing and now it's whatever. Either he succeeds and we live, or he doesn't succeed and we die. Obviously, they'll be doing other stuff.
Because you would think, because if because they like problem solving. It's like if you could like go immerse a bunch of tanks in Venus's atmosphere, which is a very high pressure and high temperature, right? You could do the same thing Eridanians did, right? And essentially do same effect, right?
But we
and all you needed was to do it quickly.
We don't have the materials, right? We don't have the materials to survive, that will survive on Venus. That's the problem. So, and it goes back to the thing of like, yeah, you can try to research your way out of it, which is what they try to do with all of the zero-G equipment. But then decide that, yeah, we don't have enough time to sort of stress test all of this and make sure it's all going to work. So it's easier to just set up that centrifuge system and generate artificial gravity there, rather than trying to build a whole set of zero gravity tolerant lab equipment. And I think the same thing applies that in 5-7 years time, you can maybe build things that tolerate Venus atmosphere, but is that really going to, like, will you be able to trust it, I guess?
You could create so much energy output from just that one thing. You could just heat up the planet with that. I don't know. It just seemed like they had this like miracle power source on their hands. The answer to everything, right? Space travel, energy needs, everything. And they said, let's chuck this guy to Tau City, and that's our last.
I think you're missing the point there. Like by saying that, we can just use that to heat the planet, and it's like the whole problem is that the output of the sun is decreasing, and you're not creating any energy there. You're just sucking in the sun's energy and storing it. So,
that part is fine. But I'm saying in terms of their backup plans and things they talk about, they don't talk about anything. It's just like, this is the Hail Mary, this is
because,
it.
But that's what, like,
again,
I think it might be happening in the background.
Yeah, it might be happening in the background. Like, all we have is this dude's experience, right? What we know is only the stuff that he knows. You don't know what Eva Strat is doing in the background.
That's fair.
Like, what her plan B is, you don't know. So
that's fair. It's the same thing for Eridanians, right? So it's like, I do like, just to jump to there, but I do like that whole explanation of why they ended up meeting, where it's like, hey, who else is going to be here? It's just going to be the
Yeah.
civilizations which stuck.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
I was like, that's interesting. But somewhere I thought that their level of like no knowledge of radiation,
Can I
no
actually
computers.
talk about the gripe that I had?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Wasn't it weird that they have never traveled in space and then they make this mission and it works? They have no idea about general relativity. They have no visibility of stars, and then somehow they have crafted this mission and it's somehow successful.
So the
It's-
counterpoint.
Or did I miss
No, no,
something?
no. You're-
Is it successful?
I mean, in the end, and regardless of whether they would have succeeded without our protagonist, I think the fact that even one guy made it alive to a whole different solar system is still pretty crazy. But
With no prior experience at all.
so the only counterpoint that I offer to this is that
They have some experience of life in space. They have a space elevator which goes up a certain way, so they know what to do around their orbit. But they don't have any experience of what space is like beyond a certain diameter outside their atmosphere, outside their orbit.
right, and the counterpoint that I want to offer is that for the listeners who obviously don't know me, I design microprocessors for a living. And I've been doing that for like 9 years now. And about 2 years into this job, I decided that it is some kind of miracle that microprocessors work. They are so insanely complicated and so riddled with bugs that it is insane to me that we build these things and they actually work. And 7 years after that epiphany, I'm still here and I'm still in the same position as I look at these things and I'm like, I literally cannot believe that this actually works, even though I build this for a living. And therefore, from that point of view, I'm like, yeah, like maybe it's possible. Like it's insanely complex, but if you do a great job of engineering it, sure.
Okay, just a thought experiment. Right? When I heard when they're describing the Eridanian, it came to the part that they didn't have computers and they didn't know what radiation was. I thought these were like Nazis in space, right? Like the Nazis had like lots of like advanced stuff, right? But it was like steampunk kind of stuff, right? A pure Newtonian mechanics.
Yep.
They had some magic fuel source and they built like a bunch of things, right? So is it a stretch to imagine that, let's say you go back to Sputnik days, right? But you have magic fuel that sends you at near light speed. Is it a stretch? You could probably do that, right? Like you could maybe they're not the first, right? Maybe the first to survive, just like Sputnik, right? So or they shot because they could create more fuel than they needed, and this is to just shoot off people. Maybe they did that. But I was like, I don't know. They seemed very steampunk in their kind of how they were described.
That's actually a good point. It reminds me of this short story. I don't know if it was a short story or just a copy pasta I read on the internet, but the gist of it basically is these guys with bayonets who show up to invade and take over Earth. And they just get laughed out of the room because it's like, we have guns, you guys have bayonets, and it's a horrible, the whole thing is a disaster. And the point of it is just that Earth has taken a very long time to discover spaceflight versus all the other technologies, whereas some other civilization discovers spaceflight very early, and they are basically like medieval people jumping around between the stars. And so I guess the order in which you discover certain technology need not be the same as what it was on Earth. And so
also they are very resistant to everything else, right? They don't suffer from physically they're very tough, so they don't need a lot of the stuff that humans need to survive in space, except for radiation, which they don't even know about.
But consider the example of astrophage, where like we discover, like the humans discover astrophage and they just put it to use for bloody everything, from weapons to, or like they could potentially start thinking about all possible ways to use astrophage. So I don't feel like if you discover space travel, you're going to be really lagging around and like carrying bayonets with you. And I'm sure like you have made enough technical progress in all the lower fields enough to like.
But the gist is just that they understand that exploiting resources and stuff from other planets with faster than light travel gives you such a jump in your industrial age that you would always do that first. Like you would never give up on seemingly limitless resources in space if you had the opportunity. Like if you had faster than light space travel is the point of that story. So I don't want to get bogged down in discussing that now. It's just that I can believe that you do things in a different order and still get good outcomes.
Yeah, I can believe that. Because if you look at
it's fine to do. I just feel like you cannot directly discover general relativity without even discovering Newtonian physics. That is my concern here.
But they haven't discovered general relativity.
No. What I'm saying is, like, analogously, they cannot directly reach a different solar system where they can't even like explore their own solar system. Like it's not like space elevator, then
maybe they just do Newtonian mechanics in their mind, right? Like because they're so good at math, right? And they do everything through echolocation, which means that they have some innate system for doing like mechanical calculations, right? Whereas like general relativity,
It's not about thinking, it's about like iterative experiments. Like you are going to fail a bunch of times before you finally succeed.
Yeah, no, it's just what I find particularly great about this whole conversation is that we've all given this book 5 stars, and
Yes,
but
yeah,
that's fine. We always complain about it, but it's like we found 3 unique things that no one can convince us that this is not dumb. It's like Vivek is like you cannot have international cooperation. Varad is like you cannot have
that is not a
this
matter
ship
of
cannot.
debate now. I'm saying it's a matter of fact, right?
But that's what I'm saying. Like it's just
nobody debates
it's like
that.
we have 3 separate sticking points that we refuse to budge on. I just find that amazing for a book.
Let's
Let's
talk
talk
about
about
the
the
good things.
Okay. One last point on general relativity. It depends on light, and these people have no experience of light. So Newtonian mechanics is the only thing they do because they do echolocation. So it's believable to me that they don't
That's a good point.
understand that concept because it's just outside their perception.
Yep. Okay. So I think we only have maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and the stuff I do want to talk about, I guess let's just get to like the 2 big things that come after this, right? We've established that astrophage is some kind of bacteria. It's eating the sun. We've found Rocky out in orbit around Tau Ceti, and Ryland Grace and Rocky are getting together and solving these problems. So the thing that they figure out is that why does Tau Ceti not have this dimming problem? They figure out where the Petrova line is going to in Tau Ceti. They get to some planet and they figure out that, oh, there must be something special about the planet that's causing it. The first thing that they do is just look at the atmosphere and see, is there some kind of gas in the atmosphere that inhibits reproduction of the astrophage, which they don't find to be the case. Then they go deeper into the atmosphere in like an extremely Hollywood, in fact, reminiscent of one of the stupid parts of the Martian movie. They go and scoop up a chunk of the lower atmosphere of that planet and figure out that, oh, there is life that eats the astrophage. And so it's really a simple matter of introducing that life to Venus and whatever the similar planet is in Eridani 40. So that's one plot point. Which, do you all have anything to say about that?
The only thing I had was that why was he hanging around Tau Ceti not doing anything?
Who was?
Rocky. He was just hanging around.
Because he's not a scientist.
He was documenting and stuff, but why didn't he go to that planet before?
Because he didn't have any means of collecting astrophage. They talk about that, how like the collector broke off. And again, this going back to what you were saying, Varad, that how did they succeed? They didn't succeed because the collector literally sheared off the ship in transit. And so it would have been a complete failure. Yeah.
I'm just surprised they even managed to get here. But anyway.
Let's not go down this again. I'm just saying that wasn't a full success. Obviously, like his 25 of his crew died, and the main part of this experiment, which was to collect the astrophage, that didn't, like, it wouldn't have succeeded because their collector broke down. So he needed Ryland Grace to show up and help him collect the stuff. So they have this very Hollywood sequence where they pick up the stuff, they find the thing that eats the astrophage, that's all great. And then the big sticking point is the fact that it dies completely in an atmosphere like Venus and the atmosphere like Eridani 40's third planet. It doesn't survive there.
I think nitrogen is the main.
Nitrogen kills it.
Yeah.
And I think I'll let you all, do you all want to geek out about the solution? Otherwise I can.
But yeah, before we go, you can go ahead with the solution. I just had one problem with that. So even if there is this species eating away at the astrophage is still going to like keep feeding off of that sun, of that star. Except that it will be at a linear rate and not a exponential rate. So I feel they should have seen some dimming going on. They say that it's not affected at all, and I thought that doesn't make sense because
I think it's that it reaches some kind of equilibrium where
10%.
The astrophage cannot. No, the 10% dimming is the left unattended point of equilibrium.
Yeah.
But with the tau amoeba which eats the astrophage, with the tau amoeba in place, it finds a different point of equilibrium. At that point, the sun will basically catch up. It'll find that equilibrium at whatever, 99. I don't know if they have a number. They probably have a number, but let's say 99%, at which point you have not significantly affected the output of the sun.
So you're saying like the sun starts burning up energy faster to sort of make sure it no longer dims?
No, it doesn't speed up. It's just that the astrophage cannot keep up the consumption rate which keeps the sun down.
Yeah. But the astrophage is still going to keep on traveling between sun and that planet. So they're still going to end up using energy. It's just that the replication is stopped because of the tau amoeba. But the ones that are still alive, this sort of two-way commute is still going on, which means the energy is being consumed, which means the sun should keep dimming except
No, the
at a...
sun will not keep dimming if you reach equilibrium, right? Like if you reach
Yeah.
some point where the astrophage consumes 1% of the sun's output consistently and it cannot consume any more, then you are just at that level. There is no further dimming.
Yeah, it just replenishes at faster than the rate at which they consume energy.
I'll have to think about it.
But I'm pretty certain humans would hunt the astrophage into extinction the moment they plan to go to nature, because that is so useful. That would anyway have a good...
Yeah. But so to talk about the solution, since neither of y'all took me up on my offer, I'm going to geek out about it. It's very, very cool. I don't recall if they mention it exactly, but it's pretty much exactly what they're trying to do with the long-running E. coli experiment that's been going on Earth for like the last 25, maybe longer period of time, years now, where they picked up a population of E. coli, and E. coli feeds on glucose. But they found that a very small amount of E. coli can consume, I believe citric acid is the other thing, citric acid instead. And they basically just kept breeding them in the absence of glucose and in the presence of citric acid to a point where human beings have evolutionarily modified E. coli bacteria to a point where you have a large population that can just eat citric acid. And I think that's basically what they do here, where they just say that, oh, even though nitrogen generally kills it, maybe there must be like a very small population that survives it. And we just like keep winnowing it down until we create a large enough population such that the dominant population of tau amoeba is resistant to nitrogen. And they start at like very low levels of concentration and keep bumping that up as the resistance increases. And at about 5% or something is where it's good enough for Venus. So Earth's problem is solved. And then they have to run more iterations to make it worthwhile for Rocky's planet. And that's how they solve it, which I thought was like a very, very cool solution to that problem. And yeah, I enjoyed that.
What was even more fascinating is how science does not work the way you want it to work, and how this sort of artificial selection also causes the tau amoeba to also learn how to escape these airtight containers.
Was that what that was? Like that's how I understood it the first time around. But the second time around, when I was reading it, it felt to me like it was that the tau amoeba penetrates astrophage because astrophage has some unpenetrable exterior. And so it is already evolved to penetrate through those gaps. And therefore it's able to get through xenon.
No, but they have those special containers, right? Xenonite containers. So it learns to penetrate xenonite.
Right.
Yeah, it learns to travel through its molecular structure.
Yeah, so I thought that whole section was super cool. And so, whereas I think I want to let you drop with enough time in hand. So any closing thoughts that you might have for a couple of minutes before you can drop off?
I think the bromance between Rocky and Grace was super wonderful. I think it was just super cute the way Rocky communicates and like how he ends each question with like the word question. I think that was like super nice. And just that one hilarious moment towards the beginning of the book where like Rocky gives him a new metal ball, but Grace does not know like what element that is. And so he goes off and does this whole experiment, which was a super cool experiment, and comes back and like Rocky is holding a model of iron. I just had to mention that. So I think that was the highlight of the book for me. But anyway, I think that was all pretty much great book, and I like the fact that all three of us like gave it a very high rating for the first time.
Okay, so I'll let you drop, and we'll continue the conversation. There's just a little bit more to wrap up.
Bye. Thank you both.
Thanks. Yeah, so I guess having talked about all of this stuff, having talked about how they breed the tau amoeba to finally defeat the astrophage, I guess the last bit remaining is what we were getting to, the fact that the tau amoeba eats, or the evolved tau amoeba at least eats through the xenonite and causes massive problems. So Vivek, what did you think about where that went? Like, you want to talk about that whole last arc in the plot?
Yeah, so I think that was a great part, like good twist in the book, that about the whole fact that it evolves to its containment facility as well. So eventually they collect enough of the tau amoeba, they kind of cultivate it to the point where it's suitable for introduction to Venus in Earth's case, and in the Eridanian's case, Planet 3. And then they part ways and each are taking back their samples. So one thing we should just mention is that the Hail Mary, the Earth ship, has 5 probes which can carry back data and samples back to Earth, because the Earth actually sent the Hail Mary as a suicide mission, so they didn't have time to cultivate enough fuel for a return trip. But because the Eridanians used Newtonian math instead of general relativity, they actually vastly overestimated how much fuel they needed. And so their ship was like lots of extra fuel. So Rocky just gives him a bunch of fuel. And so he's able to actually try and come back home. But on his way back, he realizes that this amoeba has leaked, and the amoeba eats the fuel essentially, and kind of completely makes the ship defunct. So he manages to contain it, realizes what's happened, and then realizes that it's because it's adapted to xenonite, which is xenon made into metallic form that somehow the Eridanians have perfected a process. And it's the strongest material known to man for sure, and pretty much the known universe. So he realizes that will mean that Rocky's ship is also crippled at some point of time, and that he won't actually be able to make it back to his planet. So one small discrepancy is that humans thought of putting probes, but the Eridanians didn't. And that was a small discrepancy. It's like, why did they not think of that? Maybe because they didn't think it would be a suicide mission, but they should have, because it was the first time that they were going to shoot something into space.
Right.
So they had no idea. And they didn't have probes. And I was like, why did they not have probes? That should have been there. But they didn't have computers, actually. That's why they didn't have probes.
Oh, they didn't have probes because they didn't have computers. Yep.
They didn't have computers, that's right.
Yes, it can't find its way back to their system.
Yeah. It was a steampunk ship, right? So,
Yep.
so now he's faced with a quandary because he can either go home or he can go back and try and save his friend. But in the process, it would mean that he would probably die because he didn't have any food beyond a certain point. And the Eridanian food it was full of heavy metals and not suitable for consumption by humans. So in the end, he releases the probes and he goes back to save Rocky. And eventually, I think it's a bit of a miracle that he ends up finding him. They do a bit of science foo on him using the Petrova flares and knowing the trajectory path and things like that. But I still found it amazing that he actually found his ship. But he ends up finding him and he saves him.
In the last episode, we were talking about how people accidentally stumbled upon a rogue planet. So I think this is definitely more believable than that.
Yeah, okay, he knew where he went, so maybe that was helpful. And then he had a pretty fast ship, and there was this signal flare. The ship had a very noticeable kind of flare, right? Signal. Yep. So he finds Rocky and he saves him, and so Rocky is of course very grateful when they end up going back to his planet, where he realizes that he can eat actually the Taumiba kind of leftovers which are there, and he survives on that. Goes back and then gets rehabilitated on the Eridanian planet as a kind of honored guest / school teacher / zoo exhibit. And where he and Eridanians also live for like 800 years. So he's aging very rapidly. He's now like in his late 50s, 60s. He's been through a lot. And the Eridanians eventually figure out how to feed him by creating a nutrient mix and things like that. Actually, that part was really like gross, where they like basically cultivate his own tissue and feed him burgers made of that. That's what he eats, and he basically keeps eating himself. Yeah. And then he just becomes a school teacher on Eridanian to these like spider kids. And hangs out with his friend Rocky, and then humanity ends up being saved, and he's like chilling. So it's a really nice arc. I really like that part of it, which is humanity at its best. Saving others, being actually one of those few stories where we are like the superior race, right? We are like bestowing knowledge and this thing, and actually saving people and all of that. And it's like, wow, it's a really nice.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if I would say we're the superior race, but we're definitely like equals. Like we're not the backward race, I guess is the better way to put that, because
we are definitely more scientifically advanced than them. Because we had computers, we knew a lot more about space.
But none of that stuff it's basically none of the stuff that we would want to do would have worked either in the absence of their technology, right? Like they were technologically advanced in their context and we were in ours. And so like without Xenonite, the whole book falls apart. Like Xenonite is like the magic material that solves so many problems in the book.
That's true. But they have like Xenonite. That's like resource, right?
It's not a resource. They create it. No, they create it. Like it's some
They created, it's true, but in the end, if you remember, they have technology exchange. So before they part ways to try and go back to their own planets, like Rocky takes a computer from him, it takes like a dump of like Wikipedia and like all the software in the planet and all the information so they can pass through it. Which now I'm thinking of like 3-body problem, and like as like Cixin Liu would have like rolled and like shot himself 10 times over if he ever read this book, because it'd be like it's the antithesis to all of those things, right? Like it is actually complete antithesis to all of those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a very optimistic kind of cheerful book, and that's another reason why it's fun to read, right? Like it's what Varad said, like the chemistry between the two main characters is fantastic. Really, it's genuinely funny in parts. It generally has like this relentlessly cheerful tone. Like it's a nice book.
We should just mention a little bit about Ryland Grace, the character, because I think initially I was a little annoyed with the way he would narrate, because it was very like informal or silly. Like, there were parts where he's like, "Oh, this is the NSA, this is the CIA." I was like, Poona, a scientist, you're American, you should know these things. Like, you've already. But then you kind of realize through time that he's kind of a weirdo. Like, he was ostracized from the scientific community for his weird ideas. Then he became a school teacher, and he's kind of a coward. And eventually he gets kind of conned into being part of this mission because so in order to actually do this hyperspace travel, humanity has to be you have to be under coma because you can't undergo the psychiatric or physical effects of extended space travel. And coma, however, is fairly destructive of the human body, and there are very few people who have genetic resistance to the effects of coma. And so they do a scan for that, and they figure out that there's a small minority of the population which possesses that, which includes Ryland Grace. So, and eventually, through an accident, a couple of the people who were scheduled to actually go on the mission die, and then at the last minute, they have to kind of trick him essentially and sedate him and put him, and basically erase his memories through drugs, and they put him on the mission. And that's why he ends up with amnesia and all that, and he kind of realizes that, wow, I'm like this loser who's like the last hope of humanity, when he actually does it. And he has this nice arc where at the end he's like back to teaching, and he's kind of saved humanity and he's at his arc. And I really like that. It's like, this character was kind of like, what is this character? Then he actually had this really nice arc, and all in a kind of positive light. So I thought that was good. Like, not many.
It was
stories.
nice. Like I enjoyed all of it. It was definitely a fun book. So were the Russian astronaut and the Chinese astronaut, were they like actual astronauts?
You mean his co-passengers who died? They were astronauts, yes, because they.
So he only replaced the mission specialist, right?
He replaced the mission specialist. So there were 2 mission specialists who died in an accident.
Yeah.
And the mission specialist was like a scientist like basically some generalist who had understanding of microbiology and general science, and also was like a technical person. And because of the construct that there were only 3 people, I'm not sure what the Russian astronaut was supposed to do, but she was there.
I think she was the tech, like the.
Oh yeah, she was the
Chinese
engineer.
guy. I think was the pilot and the captain. The Russian was the engineer, and this guy was the scientist. Ryland Grace was the scientist.
Yeah, so that was the thing. So he replaces those characters, and
okay, yeah, no, then I can't make a reference to one of my favorite but also silliest movies of all time, Armageddon, where where they decided it was easier to train.
Just send.
It was easier to train a drilling crew to become astronauts than it was to train astronauts to drill holes.
Astronauts to become drilling.
But that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
They only found one scientist and decided it's easier for this one scientist to be an astronaut than for an astronaut to learn all this dude science. So
it made sense. He had the gene. He was familiar with the program. Yeah. So I was like, okay, fine. I get that part. And it was a nice little, like, that the whole, he's not a hero. I thought he was like very competent for whom they showed him to be. He problem solve, like, but that's like all these characters in his books, I guess, right?
Yeah.
They're like super competent at problem solving.
And I think
they never make mistakes. Like, besides, like, they don't really ever make mistakes.
No, they do make mistakes. They're just not never catastrophic ones. And whenever I come across things like this in books, where like, oh, what are the odds of this thing succeeding? And then I'm like, yeah, but like, if I were to go to, like, yeah, 5% of the time this works, 95% of the time it doesn't work. But then 95% of the time you're just reading a different book. Like, it's not this book that you're reading. Like, in this book, the 5% chance works. And so, like, I have to allow that. Because otherwise it's just a whole different story. So that's fine. Like,
yeah, that's why. Like, so all the other things in it as like that was fine. They do make some mistakes. That's right. They screw up on the taking the stuff out, and they forget that the planet reflects heat back onto the ship, and he overestimates the ability of the ship.
And I think that's true even of his other book, right? Like, I forget, Artemis, I think, was the second book that he wrote, which also has like a character like this, which just solves problems. Like, I think this is his genre. And if he can just continue working on better character growth and in some instances a little bit better writing, like I've already complained about that in part 1, so I don't want to beat that dead horse. But yeah, just like a little bit better writing. Like, I really look forward to whatever other stuff Andy Weir is going to write. Like, I think these are good books. Like, I've enjoyed all of them. I think I enjoyed this probably the most, The Martian, after this. And then finally, I think Artemis is probably like my least favorite of the 3. But they're all good books.
Yeah, I like this. I just like thematically it's more interesting. He had some interesting ideas on alien civilizations and all that. For a minute, I was like, oh yeah, maybe it is only carbon, oxygen, and there's a reason for that and so forth. Yeah, it's a good book. I mean, it's entertaining to rip it apart also if you want. But but enough concepts.
That's our tradition, right? Like, praise a book and then complain about it for 45 minutes.
Just the human stuff. That part is like pure like science fiction.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's like it's great.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we've talked about everything that we wanted to. So with that, I guess we can call to conclusion this episode. A reminder again that our next episode we'll be talking about Permutation City by Greg Egan. And if y'all have any feedback for us, let us know at poonasfbookclub@gmail.com. And thank you for being here with us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye.
See you. Bye.